So imagine a scenario where the physical flow of a river becomes just as potent as deploying an actual army. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to decode a really high-stakes geopolitical shift that's unfolding right now in South Asia. We'll be looking at how a tragic local event has rapidly snowballed into a masterclass on strategic leverage and hydrodiplomacy. If you've ever wondered how modern nations are using natural resources, economic friction, and diplomatic deep freezes as non-kinetic weapons, well, you are in exactly the right place.
Okay, let's dive into this. For decades, geopolitical battles were primarily fought over borders, airspace, things like that. But what happens when a 60-year-old water treaty, a fundamental resource allocation agreement, suddenly becomes the absolute front line of a conflict? We're moving way past traditional warfare here. We're entering this completely new era where data, trade, and literally the natural flow of rivers are being weaponized to apply massive systemic pressure.
To really understand the strategy, we first have to look at the trigger. The catalyst for this entire chain reaction was a devastating terrorist attack in the Biastaran Valley of Pahalgam in Jammu and Kashmir. It tragically claimed the lives of 26 civilians. The Resistance Front, which is a proxy of the banned Pakistani-based Lashkar-e-Taiba, actually claimed responsibility. So this wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It became the immediate tipping point that forced the Indian government to deploy a rapid, totally unprecedented 5-point action plan.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. 1. The trigger and fallout. 2. Geopolitical root causes. 3. The Indus water system. 4. Hydrological leverage. And 5. The overarching security doctrine.
Section 1. The trigger and fallout, a diplomatic freeze. Let's look at the immediate cascading effects sparked by the Pahalgam tragedy.
Right after the attack, India's Cabinet Committee on Security executed a swift, hard-hitting 5-point plan. They placed the Indus Waters Treaty in abeyance, completely shut down the Attari-Wagah border to all people and goods, revoked the SARC visa exemption scheme, expelled Pakistani military advisors, and slashed diplomatic staff down to just 30 personnel. In immediate retaliation, Pakistan suspended bilateral agreements, including the 1972 Simla Agreement, and crucially, closed its airspace to Indian flights. Think about the systemic interconnectedness here. An airspace closure doesn't just mean a slightly longer flight. It directly translates to massive increases in fuel costs for Indian flights heading to the Gulf, Europe, and the US. It's severe, calculated economic friction on both sides.
And speaking of economic friction, that brings us to this critical number, $1.2 billion. That represents the total bilateral trade between the two nations in 2024. Now, what makes this number so tragic from an economic standpoint is that it represented a super fragile 127% recovery from the previous year. With Pakistan now suspending all forms of trade, even transit trade via third countries, that fragile recovery? Instantly wiped out. Gone.
Section 2. Geopolitical root causes, the perfect storm. So why exactly is this severe escalation happening right now?
Well, it's literally a perfect storm of internal instability. Pakistan views India's 2019 integration in Kashmir as a direct challenge, prompting a desperate need to reassert influence. But if we zoom out even further, Pakistan is facing intense international isolation right now, with even traditional allies kind of distancing themselves. Add to that a crumbling domestic economy, absolutely soaring inflation, and a rising Baloch insurgency on its western front. Finally, look at the timing. The Pahalgam attack actually coincided with high-profile diplomatic visits to India and Saudi Arabia. From an analytical perspective, this strongly suggests a deliberate attempt at global messaging. It's a violent signal of continued relevance in South Asia amidst a very deep domestic crisis.
Section 3. The Indus water system, the ultimate leverage. Now we're getting into the biggest mental model of this explainer.
Because the true centerpiece of India's retaliation isn't just closing a border. It's the suspension of a living, breathing system of resource allocation. The Indus Waters Treaty, signed back in 1960 and mediated by the World Bank, is the core mechanism governing the region's most vital resource. It divides the Indus River basin. The eastern rivers, the Ravi, Bass, and Sutlej, are allocated to India for unrestricted use, while the western rivers, the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, are heavily reserved for Pakistan.
Let's trace how this evolved. For decades, this treaty survived wars and major crises. But recently, the system really began to fracture. In 2023 and 2024, India sought modifications to protect its run-of-the-river hydroelectric projects, specifically the Kishan Ganga and Ratli projects, which Pakistan continuously objected to. Now, in 2025, citing Article 62 of the Vienna Convention, which actually allows treaty withdrawal due to a fundamental change in circumstances, India executed the first-ever suspension of the treaty in its entire history. Make no mistake, this is a historically unprecedented shift in water diplomacy.
Now, what's really interesting about this allocation is the sheer volume. Pakistan receives roughly 80% of the total water in the system. That massive slice isn't just nice to have, it's the absolute linchpin of its existence. 80% of its cultivated land relies entirely on these specific rivers.
Section 4. Hydrological leverage, impact, and limitations. Let's critically examine both the devastating potential and the practical boundaries of this strategy.
If we map out the real-world impact, we see profound systemic vulnerabilities. In agriculture, disrupting this water threatens Pakistan's entire food supply. Economically, the Indus system contributes a staggering 25% to Pakistan's total GDP. But there's also a huge hidden security angle here, and that's data. Under the treaty, India shared crucial river flow data. By withholding this information, India actively and severely hinders Pakistan's flood preparedness and resource management. That's the true weight of hydrological leverage. It's not just about water, it's about information.
On the flip side, what does India actually gain operationally? In a word, freedom. Complete operational freedom. By holding the treaty in abeyance, India can now carry out essential reservoir flushing on projects like the Kishanganga Dam on the Jhelum River without having to wait for peak monsoon periods. It can fast-track its run-of-the-river hydroelectric projects, completely bypass previous design restrictions, and entirely halt any Pakistani inspections.
So the crucial point here, and this is a very necessary reality check, is that while this strategic messaging is absolutely deafening, there's a hard physical limitation. India currently lacks the massive physical infrastructure required to immediately block or fully divert Pakistan's water supply overnight. That's just a fact. So at its core, this is a strategic diplomatic freeze and a long-term pressure tactic. It's not an instant physical blockade.
Section 5. The Security Doctrine. Mapping the Future. Let's zoom out and connect these dots.
How do water disputes and border closures actually connect to India's overarching grand strategy? Well, the five-point plan is really just the tip of the spear. India's long-term strategy is a highly coordinated, multi-pronged approach. First, the strengthening deterrence on the ground through high-tech border surveillance and smart fencing. Second, they're utilizing global architecture, specifically invoking Article 51 of the UN Charter for collective action against terrorism, and aggressively pushing to place Pakistan back on the FATF blacklist for terror financing. And third, they're building internal resilience through proactive counter-radicalization in those vulnerable border regions.
And this brilliantly illustrates how these actions are built right upon the three pillars of the current administration's security doctrine. First, decisive retaliation, entirely on India's terms. Second, zero tolerance for nuclear blackmail, meaning the threat of a nuclear escalation will no longer act as a free pass or a shield for proxy terrorism. And third, drawing absolutely no distinction between the terrorist who commit the acts and the state apparatus that sponsors them. It's a highly structured, constantly escalating framework for national security.
All right, finally, mastery recap, consolidation, and critical thinking. Let's pull all of this together.
Here is your 30-second final recap, folks. The tragic Pahalgam attack acted as a catalyst, triggering India's rapid 5-point diplomatic and economic freeze. The absolute centerpiece of this is the first-ever suspension of the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty, which establishes this brand-new paradigm of hydrological leverage. Now, while actual physical water diversion will take time, this suspension immediately grants India total operational control over its run-of-the-river projects and cuts off vital flood data to Pakistan. Ultimately, this all represents a shift toward a much longer-term doctrine of decisive retaliation, using everything from border tech to global platforms like the FATF to squeeze state-sponsored terrorism.
I want to leave you with this final thought. We've literally just watched a treaty that was designed to build peace become a tool to enforce it. As climate change accelerates and basic resources become scarcer, geopolitical battle lines are shifting away from traditional borders and moving directly into our river basins. If the very water that feeds a nation can be weaponized without firing a single bullet, how is this new hydrodiplomacy going to reshape the entire future of global conflict? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing the systems around you, and I will see you in the next one.